I'm Carl King, and this is the Carl King Podcast, where we learn about music, filmmaking, and the other creative arts. To support this podcast, head over to patreon.com/carlking and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my Illusionist $51 level patrons, both Hank Howard III and Chuabade. Quick shout out to my music endorsements, Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, Tune Track, and Millennia Media. Now, let's get this episode beginned. Very good friends of Carl King, we have a lot of wind happening here outside Plosive Central, so you get the added sound effect of creepy howling this week. And in between the creepy howling, we have 2 filmmaking lessons and 1 song review. Then a brief Carl King Visits segment, and we wrap it up with a musical composition of the week. But just a few quick Carl King updates before we get beginned. This weekend, Steve Vai had a major auction of his personal and professional possessions, and that's known in the industry as P&PP. Well, I couldn't stop myself, and I make so much money from this podcast that I bid on and won 6 unique Steve Vai items. And if all goes according to plan, I intend to make a little video mini documentary about them. So be on the lookout for that in the coming weeks. Second, a listener named Spodavids or Spodvids alerted me to the existence of a professor named Robert Sapolsky. His middle name is Morris, and he is currently a professor of neurobiology and neurological sciences at Stanford. Now, here's the point of this. He gave a lecture series at Stanford that's probably 30 hours long in total. I'm assuming it's the entire contents of his course on human behavioral biology. And folks, it is highly, really, very entertaining. I was immediately hooked and am ready to join his cult. He also wrote a book called Behave, which I immediately purchased and am now reading. I'll put links to those 2 items in the show notes, so please go and investigate those. And third, at the end of this month, Mike Stone and I are planning to film a new collection of drumming promotional videos to promote his drumming skills through the medium of videos. You might remember a mini documentary I shot years ago called Mike Stone Records Drums for Reinier Loopik, and it was pretty impressive stuff. Or you might remember Mike Stone's appearances, along with his parrot named Charlie, in my Morgan Agren documentary. And Mike Stone has also drummed for me. That's right, he appears on possibly my favorite track from my Grand Architects of the Universe album. The track is called The 20-Faced Cosmic Mystery of the Cosmos. I suspect that track is overlooked, but dang, did he do a good job. I'll put a link to all of those Mike Stone items in the show notes. Okay, now let's get beginned officially with some film reviews / filmmaking lessons. First up, we have Emily the Criminal, screenwritten by and directed by John Patton Ford, and it's starring Aubrey Plaza, an actress from Delaware. Another notable casting choice was Gina Gershon as an evil boss lady, and I confirmed that she has 155 credits on IMDb, but I was first made aware of her due to her performance in a film called Palmetto, and that's from 1998, and it was filmed right down the street from where I lived in Florida, which kind of blew my mind at the time. I don't remember anything about the movie aside from her being in it and that everyone was sweating. Anyway, now back to Emily the Criminal. That first scene was a strong choice. Now, when I say strong choice, that's a term I heard my improv comedy actor friend Will Mayer say probably 20 years ago. And I don't know what he meant by it, but I have used the term ever since. So in this example, I think the opening scene was a strong choice because it is mostly one continuous shot of a job interview, but it only shows one side of the conversation, which is Aubrey Plaza. Or it might be pronounced Plaza. We don't know yet. Now, normally a conversational shot between two people might have 3 to 4 different angles. You might have 2 singles with over the shoulders, a double, and maybe a wide double for coverage. And I'm making all of those terms up on the spot, by the way. But my point is, it takes a while for the filmmaker to finally reveal who Aubrey Plaza is talking to. I'm going to estimate it was probably a whole minute before that shot cuts away to reveal the other person. And that is why I call it making a strong choice. It's taking a chance, it's intentional, and it creates an effect of tension. And there is also an establishing shot of downtown LA. Well, this film sure knows how to push my PTSD buttons, because it hit me right in the center of my amygdala, because there it is. The exact hellish Wilshire Boulevard Bridge I used to walk over several times a day at my soul-sucking corporate job. And you can even see part of the building I worked in. It was probably the unhappiest time of my life. When I worked down there, I wore uncomfortable shoes, and I was terrified of my boss. And I looked out my office window and fantasized about a nuclear bomb going off, because I would have a perfect view of the end of the world. My point is, at that moment, I knew how Emily the criminal felt, because all I needed was to see that bridge. Wow. Anyway, back to the film. I was definitely sucked into it, but it's inevitable that any movie will have at least one implausible moment. And here is the one that stood out. When Aubrey Plaza gets in the sports car, and there are sound effects of extreme revving of the engine, you can see outside the window that she's not going fast at all. And that kind of took me out of it. All of that vroom vroom and tires screeching, but not actually going anywhere visually. Then again, that's what Los Angeles is all about. But look, I know this wasn't an expensive film, and getting Aubrey Plaza to speed around in a sports car was probably not going to happen. And aside from that, my disbelief was definitely suspended, so much that I rarely stopped to take notes on the film. Emily the criminal made me think about how I've always been averse to doing illegal stuff. I've just never wanted to be a criminal. Ever since I was a kid, I was a goody-goody. In fact, the only crime I can remember committing, and even getting caught, was shoplifting a picture of Steve Vai out of a magazine in Albertsons in Venice, Florida. It was a photo I had never seen and didn't have in my collection, so I tore the page out, stuck it in my shirt, and tried to walk out the door. And I was abruptly nabbed by a security guard. But my friend who was with me started raising heck with the guy and took all the heat off of me, and he ended up getting in trouble. So his mom came to get us and was forced to pay for the magazine, and she hung the photo on her fridge to punish me. And I felt like a bad person and never stole anything again. So I often wonder, why would anyone choose a life of crime? Because it's such a bad idea on the surface. Why would you ever do those things? But this film helps to explain how someone in the lower class can get sucked into it. It's like, hey, no big deal, just commit this very small crime. Shoplift from Best Buy just once. And then before you know it, just a few days later, you might be committing Grand Theft Auto. And another little observation, I liked how the film's title paid off in the scene where she meets her boyfriend's mom for the first time. It was really very well done. And all that criminal stuff aside, I identified with the situation of living in Los Angeles and trying to get a good job, but always being pushed down and treated as scum. And this film captures that distant, FU energy that everyone seems to have in the big city. It's like the more anonymous you can be, the worse you can treat others. And it reminded me of the desperation I felt as I tried to find a place to belong and be treated as a person. So I gave this film 5 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd. Up next, we have Escape from LA from 1996. And this film was directed by John Carpenter, a USC dropout. And this film's script was so complex that it required 3 people to work as a team. So it was screenwritten by John Carpenter, Deborah Hill, and Kurt Russell. Kurt Russell was 45 years old at the time, and I believe he added only a single forgettable line, which is, "Call me Snake." And that confused me because Kurt Russell actually plays a character named Bob. And by the way, he happens to be the same actor from Escape from New York, and they even look somewhat similar. But I'm not sure if this one is officially a sequel or a reboot in a different location, because they are somewhat alike, and they even recycle some of the same dialogue. Regardless, we do know that Escape from LA was in development for 10 years, because John Carpenter and his team wanted to get every little detail exactly perfect this time, especially the computer graphics for the underwater scene. And in an interview, Carpenter claimed it was exactly 10 times better than the previous movie. So I would say that makes it a success. I did notice that for this film, they used the same musical theme from Escape from New York, which was a big time saver. And from a budgetary standpoint, it's always a good thing to cut down on costs. John Carpenter probably had to pay less money to the composer. And this is an old trick borrowed from the director of the classic TV show Knight Rider. It was discovered that he would often recycle the same intro music from episode to episode in order to avoid paying his composer for brand new music every single week. Speaking of costs, the budget of Escape from LA was $50 million, and the box office was $25 million. So once again, we have the John Carpenter law, which states John Carpenter movies can only make back 50% of their budget. Now, regarding some of the other actors, I was as shocked as the rest of you. Michelle Forbes is in this film. That's right, Admiral Helena Kane from Battlestar Galactica. What a character that was. And there's also Valeria Golino from 4 Rooms, although that was my least favorite of the 4 Rooms. And it turns out the Surgeon General of Beverly Hills was Bruce Campbell. Well, I watched this whole movie and had no clue. And there's also A.G. Langer, that's Claire Danes' wild best friend from My So-Called Life, also known as Rayanne Graff. But who cares who was in this? Let's talk about the film itself. We get a heavy computer graphics exposition opening, very much in the same style as Escape from New York, and some say the usage of CGI in this film was out of control, and some say it was just what it needed. And in one of the early scenes, an actor named Commander Malloy spritzes his cactuses with a water spray bottle. And in filmmaking terminology, that is called a setup that will be later paid off in the final minutes of the story, also known as a Chekhov's cactus. And I'll get back to that later, as it is relevant to this exact filmmaking lesson. Now, I want to take a quick turn here. How many of you listeners have heard of an artist called Retro Gimmick? He hand creates these one-of-a-kind, bizarre action figures from movies, and they look like those authentic Star Wars blister packs with the logos and all that. But it's either background characters you'd never expect, or very unusual twists on them. For instance, I bought a Luke's power converters from Star Wars, which was entirely empty, because, Luke never got those power converters. And scrolling through the Retro Gimmick Etsy store, he's got a dude wearing cargo shorts, Alex Jones's gay frogs, and Darth Bajor, which is simply a Darth Vader but more beige. And I'll put a link to his Etsy shop in the bio. Anyway, my point is, I think Retro Gimmicks should make one of Commander Malloy spritzing his cactuses. And that is not a euphemism, sir. Now, at some point, the bad guys capture the main adventure hero, Bob, and handcuff him to a walking treadmill. So he has to exercise for no reason. And maybe this is a joke about how everyone in LA exercises nonstop. But in the movie, they never give a reason for it. According to my inside connections in the industry, the people who screenwrited Escape from LA literally got in a room together and said, quote, "What if we had this? What if we had that?" Unquote. And so the movie ended up with a scene in which the protagonists hang glide from Hollywood all the way to Disneyland. And that is approximately 30 miles away. Hey, that sounds totally plausible to me. But I looked it up, and it seems like the world record for hang gliding might actually be over 200 miles. Okay then, I will let everyone know. So this movie becomes a series of silly fun and games scenes like a Harry Potter movie. And because so many people feel nostalgic for this John Carpenter movie, whether it is any good or not, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd. And now, let's move on to this week's song review. We have one song review this week, and it is Saint Anger by Metallica, submitted by listener TMC3 in Florida. Now first, I want to talk about the things we can objectively measure about Saint Anger. This song was played by a DAW at 93 BPM, and that is according to my very accurate metronome. Now, I did some additional research on the internet, and some people claim that 93 BPM is the same as 92 BPM, or 95 BPM, or even 91 BPM. But I assure you, those BPMs are not the same BPMs. And it's why there are different numbers shown before the BPM part. And this might be a sort of flat earth situation, but we'll have to explore that with a real expert on tempos in a future episode. I also determined that this song is mostly in C minor, which is a good choice of key. There is a part that you could call an intro or interlude riff that has some chromatic notes around C, and that would be C, C sharp, D, and B flat. But the majority of the song, what might be called the verses and choruses, use a descending sequence of 4 notes, C, B flat, A flat, and G, which are totally diatonic to C minor. So far, so good. But the composition itself is far less interesting than both the history and the production, those being the context for the musical notes. So let's examine those. Back in 2001 or so, Metallica set out to record a new album, but James Hetfield was struggling with an addiction to alcohol. And that is a big deal. As a person who grew up in a family of alcoholics and now has a thing called PTSD from it, I know how much that will disrupt anyone's creative process. And multiply that by how much pressure was put on him from the band, the record label, the fans, so many expectations for him to live up to. So anything critical I say here, I say with my own understanding of that. Because this album was James Hetfield, the primary songwriter of the band, trying to relearn how to be creative, all while he was reprogramming his brain in the absence of a powerful substance. And it was all taking place in the moment, in front of the whole world. Now imagine the fear you would feel in that position. Now, after taking a year off for James to recover, and with the help of a career coach, Metallica decided to reinvent themselves and try something new. Well, why not? It had been 6 years, so let's see what comes out. Well, the result was an unexpected combination of things. loosely tuned minor pentatonic nu metal guitars, unrelated song parts glued together with Pro Tools, and group-written free-form poetry lyrics. I'm only speculating, but to my ear, it sounds like they were listening to music on the radio at that time and trying to do their own version of that. And there are specific nu metal isms that creeped into Metallica's music. And one of those is the rhythm guitar style. Now, I have worked with a lot of guitarists, and I don't know why this is, but there is a thing that happens. If you hand any rock guitarist a guitar tuned to drop D, they will immediately play low, bluesy, flat fives and flat threes, and bending all over the place. All of their thrash chugging on the low E will entirely vanish from their vocabulary, and every riff will sound like grungy nu metal, basically like that Stone Temple Pilots song Dead and Bloated. And I believe this is exactly what happened to James Hetfield. There must have been someone that handed him a down-tuned guitar sometime after 1991, and that person is to blame for Load, Reload, and Saint Anger. And yes, I know James Hetfield detuned on Sad But True, but that still wasn't bluesy. The main point I want to make here is this. Tuning your guitar down has nothing to do with the harmonic or rhythmic content of the music. Consider that for centuries, pianos and even harps have notes many octaves below guitars, and that never forced anybody to play grungy blues scales on them. That low tuning and bluesy bending didn't go away, mostly, until Death Magnetic in 2008. And I'm thinking perhaps Rick Rubin told him to knock it off with the blues rock? Now, regarding the production of Saint Anger, there are a lot of technical problems, and you can only call them problems subjectively within the context of what you expect a Metallica production to be. Because if it were intentional and part of a style, it wouldn't be so much of a problem. And those problems are, most notably, hard digital cuts between sections of the songs. And by that, I mean instruments will suddenly become much louder or softer, or cut out entirely, seemingly by accident. And this is something that in the recording world would be considered an error or a mistake. And those hard digital cuts cause abrupt changes in timbre, especially in the drums. For instance, during the double bass section at 44 seconds, the snare drum drops in level where before it was extremely prominent. And it disrupts that feeling of a band jamming in a garage, to quote producer Bob Rock. So I think he really achieved the opposite of what he was going for there. The whole song sounds patched together, and that's because it was. From watching Some Kind of Monster, the songs on this record weren't written as songs. So that metaphor of Frankenstein is actually a good one to describe their creative process on a micro level. As you can see in the documentary, they went into the live room, came up with a riff, and then kind of stapled it together in Pro Tools, listened to it a few times, and then went in to come up with another riff and attached it to the other one without much consideration of how well it fit. And then they might come back a few days or weeks later and glue something else in. And this causes basic songwriting problems as well. Like when the verse of Saint Anger comes in, it's got some pitchy singing and a syncopated drum beat that confuses whatever momentum they had built up in the previous minute or so. And at 1 minute and 48 seconds, they launch into another double bass segment in which a kick drum sample was inserted over the other kick drum track for very loud accents that make no sense in reality. From a drummer's point of view, it sounds synthetic and confusing because no one on earth could play double bass with 16th notes very quietly and then accent single notes like that. And that's another artifact of working in Pro Tools in such a cut and paste manner. You start cheating and doing things that you couldn't otherwise pull off. And the more you do that, the further you get away from a natural glue that holds the performance together. When the song returns back into that ringing snare drum section at 2 minutes 37, it's another abrupt jump and the snare changes tones. And 10 seconds later, there's a harsh edit where the cymbals abruptly cut off and the drum tone changes again. And the problem is it doesn't sound intentional. It sounds like someone moved the mics when they were cleaning the room and didn't put them back in the same spot. And there's not even any attempt at a crossfade. The cymbals just chop off. And by the way, about that whole St. Anger snare tone thing, there was a guy named Matt Smith who recorded a parody of the St. Anger snare sound by banging a pen on a metal office chair, and I think he mic'd it with an SM57. And there used to be a picture of it out there, but I can't find it now. However, the recording will be linked in the show notes. Anyway, at 3 minutes, they return to the verse again with that floppy drum beat. And the main problem, I think, is that this stop and start songwriting recording workflow screwed up the energy and flow of the music. I think they would have been better off workshopping the songs from a macro level, and I mean working on the song as a whole rather than writing the songs part by part, stream of consciousness day by day. Because what they ended up with all of that cutting and pasting, is drums or vocals or guitars that aren't interacting with or matching the appropriate energy of the musical part. And the drums will have maybe the totally wrong feel against the vocals that are happening and vice versa, like they were recorded without hearing each other. And this happens all over the album. But at least, regarding the lyrics, St. Anger does make an insightful observation about anger. Quote, "It's hard to see clear, is it me or is it fear? And it took me a long time to learn that anger is actually fear wearing a disguise." So thumbs up to whoever wrote that lyric. I'm guessing it was Bob Rock. All of these problems aside, I think that Metallica were brave to make St. Anger, the entire album. And I give them major respect for it because think about it. How many bands in their position with that massive of an audience and status and cash cow would throw away their entire previous creative process? As we know, most would just keep making the same album forever and ever. So congratulations to Metallica for taking that creative chance. And thank you to TMC3 in Florida for submitting this song for examination. And now let's move on to a new edition of Carl King Visits. This past weekend, I got in the mood to read a good book. So I flew out to Ann Arbor, Michigan to shop at their world-famous bookstores. But wouldn't you know it, I got there just in time on a Sunday evening, just when they were all closing. And some people have said, "Carl, you need to plan better." But, you know, big-time LA celebrities like me are impulsive. We just decide to go and do something, and we expect the rest of the world to give us what we want. And I promise you, I learned nothing from this. The temperature in Ann Arbor was below freezing, and the sun was already setting, but I made my best effort to walk quickly and visit the following 6 bookstores: Dawn Treader, Friends of the Ann Arbor District Library Bookshop, Literati, Third Mind Books, Vault of Midnight, and the West Side Bookshop. Now, I was only able to get inside 3 of them, and I will tell you about them now. But I'm also posting a photo gallery of what I was able to capture in the few minutes I had. Bookstore number 1 was Dawn Treader. Opened in 1976, this store seems to be named after a C.S. Lewis book, and they have over 70,000 used and rare books. Now, I don't know if they do this year-round or if it's their normal aesthetic, but there were cobwebs on everything. It's like one of those ancient, chaotic, creepy bookstores from a movie. There were old books stacked haphazardly, and old as heck wooden shelves. I even spotted a first edition of Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man. And on the way out, I bought a bumper sticker for $1 cash as a souvenir for Mark Borchardt. Bookstore number 2 was Friends of the Ann Arbor District Library Bookshop. And this quote-unquote bookstore is inside the public library. And as much as I love a library, I was anxious to hit some of the other spooky bookshops down the street. So I just had my servants carry me past it. And bookstore number 3, Literati. Now, upon entering, I was told, "We're closed." But I did snap a few pictures from the doorway. And I have to say, Literati was a nice-looking shop. It was clean and brightly lit, like one of those bookstores in an airport. So it just didn't have that same spooky vibe as Dawn Treader. And I wasn't too disappointed to keep moving on down the street. Bookstore number 4 was Third Mind Books. That was a cool name for a bookstore, but also closed. I discovered their slogan is Beat and Beyond. Their specialty is works by and about the members of the Beat generation and the San Francisco Renaissance. And that makes sense because they had a Captain Beefheart original concert poster for sale in the window for $125. And I think it's great that bookstores can have a strict specialty like that. It gives me hope that someday I can have a bookstore entirely about Steve Vai and dogs. Bookstore number 5 was Vault of Midnight. And hey, this turned out to be a comic book store. And I have to say, I was impressed. It was really very cool. Upstairs it was toys, shirts, and collectibles. And downstairs was role-playing games and lots of comics. I picked up a shirt for myself, size M, and the store overall had a strong branding and a fun vibe. Turns out they have 3 locations: Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, and Detroit. And bookstore number 6 was the West Side Bookshop. Now this one turned out to be the oldest operating bookstore on the list, going back an extra year to 1975. It looked just creepy enough for my tastes, but was, of course, completely closed. It was already getting dark outside, and a man saw me from inside peeking in the windows. He almost seemed like he was going to let me in, but I just gave him a friendly wave and kept moving, as I didn't want him to go through the trouble on a freezing Sunday evening. And that was it for Carl King's visit to 6 mostly closed bookstores on a Sunday evening in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And remember, go and check out all the photos I took. I'll be posting a gallery on my blog, as well as links to all of these stores in the show notes. And now let's move on to the musical composition of the week. This week's musical composition of the week is Evil Dead Suite by Roque Banos, submitted to me by Kyle MacLeod, or MacLeod, we're not sure yet. Now this is music that originally appeared in the 2013 version of the film Evil Dead, directed by Fede Alvarez. And here's something you should know. Often, a film composer will write a suite from which they will pull apart the various musical themes and place them into individual scenes. That way, they have a bunch of ideas already approved by the director in advance. Like, here's generally what the music is going to sound like. So that sort of suite is what you will hear here. You can see the whole performance on YouTube, and it is just short of 12 minutes long. And it was difficult to count because I'm bad at counting, but it seems to be about a 100-piece orchestra, with half of those being choir. And even though it is quote-unquote film music, this will be fairly accessible to rock music type people because it quote-unquote rocks. And I'm referring to that staccato heavy metal riff in 5/4. It's catchy and it repeats plenty of times, enough for listeners to engage in some sort of headbanging. Now, here are some of the things I enjoyed about it. Number one, those choir shouts. You know, when we think of choirs, we often think of oohs and ahs, but this piece is angry. And number two, I love percussion, and this piece has plenty of that. The siren actually sounds like a person screaming, and of course we also get the wooden clackety-clacks, not sure what those are called, but they seem to have two pieces of wood joined by a hinge, and the player will smack them closed. I think clackety-clack is probably what they are called. And my favorite, the bundles of bamboo. At one point, the percussionist playing those huge bundles of bamboo quickly reaches over and bangs a metal thing with a hammer. And that sounded cool. And number three, here's something fun to spot in this video. There's a violinist guy with white hair and a beard wearing super dark glasses. Kind of like he's wearing a disguise or something. And I wonder, what was the story there? Was it kind of a Dr. Zoltan thing, or maybe he recently had an eyeball procedure? Because I've never seen an orchestra musician with dark sunglasses before. And something I actually learned from this video, during that 5/4 metal riff, I don't think it ever occurred to me that string players might bow down, up, up, down, up, up, down, up, down, up when they're subdividing fast notes into groups of three. I had assumed it was always entirely down, up, and you would need to coordinate the bowing direction beginning on either a down or an up bow, depending on how many strokes there would be. And in this case, there would be 10, meaning the riff would start on an up bow or a down bow and reverse each time that the riff went around. But in this, they're all bouncing the second and third note of the groups of three. Now, maybe I already knew this and just never saw it visually. I can't remember. But I do know I have done that sort of thing when playing rhythm guitar, which is a trick I learned from watching that old Steve Vai clinic at MI in 1984. It's a sort of double stroke you can do with your right hand. And I actually used to practice paradiddles in my strumming. And you can hear that double stroke technique used in the opening guitar part of Answers on Passion and Warfare. Little known and unimportant fact, I recorded an entire album in high school using that style of strumming, but that's another story. I'm going to put a link to Steve Vai Answers from 1984 in the show notes so you can see all those double strokes in his right hand. Now, part of the way through this Evil Dead piece, there is a funny moment where the audience thinks it's over and actually starts to clap. And one of the rules in classical music performances is this: you do not clap between movements, only at the end of an entire piece. Well, in response, the orchestra pulls what I would call a Faith No More on Hanging with MTV moment and blasts a 2D tidal wave of chaotic dissonance back at them. There's violins screeching away up and down the fingerboard, the choir screaming as loud as they can, and it is a moment of full-on horror. It's actually more than a moment because that goes on for 20 seconds. And then there's a brief pause, and the piece continues so quietly that you can barely hear them playing. I thought that was a fun surprise. The composer himself, Roque Banos, conducts the performance, and you can see how much fun he's having making such a racket. And you should know that these experiences are rare for a composer to conduct his own music performed by a full orchestra, especially one that big, and making that much noise. So I'm sure he was having the time of his life. I recommend checking out Roque Banos' Evil Dead Suite from 2013 with and without the video, and I will put a link in the description. And by the way, you can also listen to the full film score on Spotify. Okay, that's the end of this episode of the Carl King Podcast. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere else you listen to these dang podcasts. and support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 per month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or you can send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. And as always, special thanks to my $51 a month patrons at the Special Illusionist level, Chubode and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for listening. And as I always say, okay then, I will let everyone know.